Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Pollock twin reincarnation. Introduction. In the realm of paranormal, few stories are as intriguing or as detailed as the case of the Pollock twins. This famous case from mid-20th century England centers on Gillian and Jennifer Pollock, twin sisters who are believed by their parents to be the reincarnated souls of their own deceased sisters. The tale unfolds like a mystery, a tragic accident, uncanny birthmarks, childhood memories that seem to echo past lives, and decades of investigation that followed. It has captivated believers in reincarnation, challenged skeptics, and inspired ongoing debate. In today's episode, we will delve deeply into the Pollock twins' story, from the family's background and the fateful events of 1957, to the twins' early years filled with the bizarre recollections, to the scientific investigations and theories that sought to explain the mystery. Reincarnation, the idea that a soul or consciousness can be reborn in a new body after death, is a concept found in many cultures and faith. However, it was not an accepted belief in the Pollock family's devout Christian community. Remarkably, the Pollock case would emerge as one of the most famous Western examples, suggesting reincarnation might be real. As we journey through the facts and claims, we will also consider alternative explanations, from psychological influences to coincidences, in the perspective of both believers and skeptics. This is a story that spans generations, blending tragedy with hope and mystery with meticulous research. Let us begin at the beginning, with the family at the heart of it all. Chapter 1. The Pollock family in the 1957 tragedy. John and Florence Pollock lived in the quiet town of Hexham in Northumberland, England. John, born 1920, was raised Anglican, but converted to Catholicism upon marriage, and despite his Christian faith, he developed a strong personal belief in reincarnation early in life. As a boy, John read a novel about past lives that ignited his fascination with the idea of rebirth. By adulthood, he privately held reincarnation as truth, even as it conflicted with church teachings. In fact, John later admitted that he used to pray at night for proof of reincarnation, asking God to show him that souls return to live again. His wife Florence, in contrast, was a devout Salvation Army Christian and later Catholic, who did not share John's belief in reincarnation at the time. Together, they ran a small grocery and milk delivery business, and they were loving but busy parents. By the mid-1950s, the Pollocks had a growing family. They had 2 sons, John's older children from before, as later accounts suggest there were 4 older brothers in the family, and 2 young daughters. Their elder daughter, Joanna Pollock, was born on March 25, 1946, and the younger daughter, Jacqueline Pollock, was born on April 13, 1951. The family moved around during these years. After Joanna's birth in Bristol, they spent some time in Wickham, near Newcastle, and eventually settled in Hexham by the early 1950s. Because John and Florence worked long hours, the girls were largely raised by their maternal grandmother, who lived with them. This close relationship with their grandmother helped forge a tight sisterly bond between Joanna and Jacqueline. Joanna and Jacqueline were inseparable playmates, despite the 5-year age gap. Joanna, a bright and imaginative 11-year-old, loved to put on costumes and produce little plays, often acting as the leader and little mother to her younger sister. Jacqueline, at 6, adored her big sister and followed her lead in games of imagination and dress-up. Family members described Joanna as generous, creative, and mature for her age, while Jacqueline was a more typical young child, childlike, and sometimes less patient but very affectionate. Both girls enjoyed combing other people's hairs, especially their father's, as a favorite pastime. In a poignant and unsettling remark remembered by the family, Joanna had a habit of saying, "I will never be a lady." She told her father she would never grow up to be a woman, a statement that would later be seen as an eerie premonition of her fate. Jacqueline, the younger sister, had a couple of notable physical features and incidents in her short life. At age 3, she had an accident. Accounts differ slightly on the specifics, but it is said that she fell while riding a tricycle and hit her head on the pavement or on a bucket, resulting in a cut on her forehead. The injury left a small scar on the right side of her forehead near the bridge of her nose, which required stitches and remained visible as a faint, slightly depressed line. Family members noticed that this scar became more pronounced in cold weather, turning a darker color when Jacqueline was chilly. In addition, Jacqueline had been born with a distinctive birthmark, a round, dark brown mole on her left side, just above her waist. These two identifying marks on Jacqueline, the forehead scar and the hip mole, would later take on great significance. On Sunday, May 5, 1957, tragedy struck the Pollock family. That morning, Joanna, 11, and Jacqueline, 6, were walking to their local church in Hexham for Sunday school, accompanied by a neighboring child, a 9-year-old boy named Anthony. As the 3 children made their way along the sidewalk, a car suddenly swerved off the road and barreled toward them. The driver was a local woman, later identified as Mrs. Marjorie Wynne, who was in a very disturbed state. She had taken a large dose of aspirin and phenobarbital in what appeared to be a suicide attempt, suffering an emotional breakdown due to a custody battle in which she'd lost her own children. This woman seemingly decided that if she could not have her children, no one else should have theirs either. Witnesses watched in horror as her car veered onto the sidewalk at high speed, directly toward the 3 children who were walking next to a stone wall. With the wall on one side and the car coming on the other, the children had no time or space to escape. The vehicle struck Joanna, Jacqueline, and Anthony with tremendous force, a collision so violent that they were all reportedly tossed into the air like cricket balls by the impact. Joanna and Jacqueline were killed instantly at the scene, and Anthony succumbed to his injuries en route to the hospital, despite an ambulance being called. In an instant, John and Florence lost both of their beloved daughters. The incident was widely reported in newspapers across Britain, and shocked the entire community. Hexham, a peaceful town, was rocked by this nearly incomprehensible tragedy. For John and Florence, the grief was beyond measure. Each parent, however, coped in very different ways. Florence, utterly heartbroken, tried her best to avoid dwelling on the loss. She found that thinking of her girls plunged her into despair, so she focused on caring for her remaining children and maintaining a semblance of normal life. She put away the physical reminders of Joanna and Jacqueline. Their toys were boxed up and stored in the attic, and she even stopped helping with milk delivery business, where she used to wear a distinctive work smock, because it was too painful to continue that routine without her daughters. John's response, on the other hand, was quite the opposite. He could not let go of his daughters' memories and actively sought ways to feel close to them. On the day of the accident, even amid his shock, John later reported experiencing what he described as a vision of his girls in heaven. He also claimed he sensed the presence of their spirits in an upstairs room of their house shortly after their death. Drawn by this feeling, John would go up to that attic room often, sitting quietly, as if to be near Joanna and Jacqueline in spirit. He was a deeply religious man, and yet he now wrestled with conflicting interpretations of the tragedy. Part of him feared that this calamity was a divine punishment. John remembered how he had prayed for proof of reincarnation, an idea at odds with his Catholic faith, and wondered if losing the girls was God's harsh answer to those prayers. And yet, alongside his guilt and despair, another part of John held fast to a remarkable hope. He fervently believed that this was not truly the end, that somehow his daughters would find their way back to him. In the weeks after the accident, John voiced a bold conviction. He told Florence that he knew Joanna and Jacqueline would be reborn to them. Perhaps influenced by his lifelong belief in reincarnation, John became certain that his prayers would indeed be answered, and that their lost children's soul would return to the family. Florence was disturbed by her husband's insistence on this idea. To her, it sounded almost delusional and irreverent. She wanted to heal and move forward, not cling to a hope that she viewed as a fantasy. John's relentless talk of reincarnation led to intense arguments between them, to the point that their once strong marriage was under strain. Florence at one point was so upset by John's obsession that she threatened to leave him if he didn't abandon the idea that their girls would come back. For a time, the couple's grief was compounded by conflict, a mother who needed to mourn quietly, and a father who refused to let the girls go. Despite Florence's objections, fate seemed to align with John's conviction. In late 1957, some months after the tragedy, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. The pregnancy itself was a surprise blessing to the couple, but John's certainty of a supernatural outcome only grew stronger. He proclaimed that this pregnancy would result in twin daughters, none other than the reborn Joanna and Jacqueline. It's important to know how unlikely this prediction was at face value. Twins did not run in either parent's family, and in the 1950s, the chances of naturally conceiving identical twins were very slim, about 3 in 1,000. Moreover, Early prenatal examinations gave no hint of multiple birth. Florence's doctor felt only one fetus during routine palpation and detected a single heartbeat. The medical consensus was that Florence was carrying one child. John was undeterred. He openly disagreed with the doctor, maintaining steadfast that there were two babies, the souls of their departed daughters. One can imagine the tension and emotion in the household during those months. Florence likely hoping for a healthy baby and dreading John's reaction if his projection failed, and John praying with absolute focus for twin girls to vindicate his belief. On October 4th, 1958, Florence went into labor. To everyone's astonishment, except possibly John's, she gave birth to not one but two babies. They were twin girls, born healthy and active at a local Hexham hospital. The chance event that John had so confidently foretold had come true. It was as if his conviction had manifested reality. The Pollocks named the twins Jillian and Jennifer. Jillian was the firstborn twin, arriving 10 minutes before her sister. Jennifer was born second. The twins were monozygotic, or identical, as blood tests later confirmed. This meant they came from the same fertilized egg and shared the same genetic makeup, an important fact to remember, as it would make some of their differences all the more inexplicable. For a brief time, the joy of having two new daughters filled the Pollock home, tempering the lingering sadness. Florence, who initially had rejected the idea that these could be her lost children returned, was likely simply relieved that the babies were safe, and that John's unsettling prediction of twins was validated by reality. John, of course, was elated. In his eyes, this was nothing short of a miracle and a divine sign. However, the true test of his reincarnation belief would come in the months and years ahead as they watched these twins grow. Almost immediately, John and Florence noted some striking physical details about baby Jennifer. While newborn Jillian had no unusual marks, Jennifer bore two marks that mirrored Jacqueline in an uncanny way. First, on Jennifer's forehead, at the bridge of her nose, was a small birthmark with the appearance of a scar, in precisely the same spot where Jacqueline had once been scarred by her accident. It was unusual for an infant to have a mark that looked like an old scar, yet here it was, a light line on the skin above her right eye, just as her late sister had. Secondly, Jennifer had a round dark birthmark on her left side, just above her hip. Again, in exactly the same location as Jacqueline's birthmark. These two marks on Jennifer were a profound discovery for the Pollocks. Even Florence, who was still not predisposed to believe in reincarnation, found it hard to explain away the coincidence. The rest of the family had no similar birthmarks, and here was one twin carrying both distinctive markers of the sister she never met. John took it as confirmation that Jennifer was the reincarnation of Jacqueline, and that perhaps Jillian would likewise prove to be Joanna reborn. According to Florence's later recollection, Jennifer's birthmark on the left side was slightly raised or depressed to the touch and became more visible in cold weather, exactly as Jacqueline's forehead scar had behaved. The parallel was difficult to ignore. Modern experts note that in purported reincarnation cases, it's relatively rare to have birthmarks corresponding to non-fatal wounds, like Jacqueline's scar from a fall. Far more often, birthmarks match the location of fatal injuries, but rare is not the same as unheard of, and the Pollock case provided a notable example. Perhaps even more intriguing, given that Gillian and Jennifer were genetically identical twins, is that only Jennifer had these marks. Genetically, identical twins should not have large discrepancies, like one twin having a unique birthmark pattern that the other lacks. Heredity alone couldn't account for Jennifer's specific marks. This point was not lost on John or on later researchers. Something beyond simple genetics or chance appeared to be at work. In the months after the twins' birth, Florence gradually came around to a more accepting stance of John's belief, at least to the extent of considering the possibility that something unusual was happening. The tension between them eased as they both devoted themselves to raising the babies. However, Florence maintained a cautious approach. She did not declare the twins to be their late daughters reborn. She simply focused on loving them in the present. John, privately convinced as he was, took a similarly careful approach in one respect. He vowed not to influence the twins or push the idea of their past identities onto them during early childhood. Despite his strong belief, he understood that any overt suggestion could contaminate the evidence. If these twins truly were reincarnations, John wanted the proof to emerge naturally, not because he planted ideas in their heads. Life took another turn in the spring of 1959, when the twins were about 9 months old. The Pollock family decided to move away from Hexham. They settled in the seaside town of Whitley Bay, also reported as moving to Whitehaven in some accounts, but multiple sources say Whitley Bay, which is on the northeastern coast of England. The reason for the move likely included a desire for a fresh start after the trauma, and possibly business opportunities elsewhere. What's critical is that after this relocation, Gillian and Jennifer grew up their first few years away from Hexham, having no ordinary means of knowing the places or people that had been part of Joanna and Jacqueline's world. The family did not return to visit Hexham during the twins' infancy or toddler years. In effect, the twins had no direct exposure to their sister's hometown or the community that remembered the tragedy, at least not until they were older. This fact would make some of their later statements all the more difficult to rationalize. Thus, by the end of the 1950s, the Pollock family had endured unimaginable loss, an unexpected renewal. They went from having 2 daughters to none, and then to 2 again in the span of about 18 months. Unbeknownst to them, the next chapter would involve a series of uncanny events that would propel their story from a private family matter into one of the most perplexing and celebrated cases in reincarnation research. With the stage set, we now turn to the early childhood of Gillian and Jennifer Pollock and the signs of a past life that began to surface. Chapter 2: Early Signs. In the first few years of their lives, Gillian and Jennifer Pollock appeared to be ordinary, happy children. The family by then resided in Whitley Bay, far from the painful reminders in Hexham. It wasn't until the twins were about 3 years old that the past seemed to creep back in through the fragile barrier of childhood innocence. What followed between the ages of roughly 3 and 7 was a series of remarkable statements recognitions, and behaviors from the twins that left John and Florence simultaneously astonished and uneasy. We will examine these early signs in detail, one by one, to appreciate why the Pollock twins case became such a rich source of fascination. Strange recognitions of former belongings. When Jillian and Jennifer were around 3 years old, John decided to bring out some old toys from storage. These were not just any toys. They were the cherished playthings that had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. Since the tragedy, the Pollocks had kept these items packed away in the attic, out of sight. Now, with a pair of lively young girls in the house again, John and Florence may have felt it was time to let the twins play with the toys and give them new life. They did not, however, tell the twins whose toys these had been. According to the parents, Jillian and Jennifer had never seen these toys before, at least not in a way that they could remember. The toys had been stored away since before the twins could crawl. As the story goes, when the box was opened, the two little girls immediately reacted with excitement and apparent recognition. Among the items were two favorite dolls that had once been Christmas presents to the late sisters. Without any prompting, Jillian eagerly claimed one doll, saying it was hers, while Jennifer grabbed the other. In fact, Jillian chose a doll that had belonged to the older sister Joanna, and Jennifer picked the doll that had belonged to Jacqueline, mirroring the exact original ownership. The twins also referred to them as gifts from Santa Claus, just as Joanna and Jacqueline used to call them. Their parents listened in stunned silence. This was precisely correct, yet no one had told the twins of the origin of these dolls. Even more striking, the girls did not squabble over the toys, even though toddlers often fight over playthings. It was as if each twin knew which doll ought to be hers and was content with that choice. They played happily, each with the right doll, requiring no parental mediation. For John and Florence, this incident strongly echoed the behavior of Joanna and Jacqueline, who had their own dolls and distinct favorites. The lack of argument was notable. Observers pointed out that 2 3-year-olds typically wouldn't divide a pile of toys so peacefully unless they had some familiarity or agreement, something these girls weren't supposed to have about toys they'd never seen. In the same session of unpacking old things, Jillian also spotted a toy clothes wringer, a little hand-cranked toy for pretend laundry that had been Joanna's, and she exclaimed, "Oh, that's my toy wringer. Santa brought it for me." This was exactly right again, and it was an object that had been out of circulation for years. Such moments gave the Pollocks chills, as if they were watching a replay of their departed daughter's Christmas morning. Memories of the accident. Perhaps the most chilling and convincing signs were the spontaneous statements the twins made about the car accident that killed Joanna and Jacqueline. Remember that John and Florence had tried not to discuss the tragedy in front of the twins, especially in the early years. Florence in particular avoided the subject. By the time the twins were toddlers, the family had also moved, so the environment itself gave no obvious reminders. Despite these precautions, the twins themselves began to talk about the accident in startling detail. Florence reported that she occasionally overheard the girls talking to each other about the incident, almost as if reliving it in their play. On one occasion, she came upon Jillian and Jennifer In an alarming roleplay, Jillian was cradling Jennifer's head, saying, "The blood's coming out of your eyes. That's where the car hit you." Florence was stunned. In the real accident, little Jacqueline had suffered a severe head injury with bleeding around her eyes. When John identified the bodies after the crash, Jacqueline's head was bandaged above the eye. There is no way a 3-year-old child like Jillian could know or imagine such a specific detail unless she somehow remembered seeing it. Yet, here was Jillian acting out the role of the older sister, comforting the younger, describing an injury exactly matching how Joanna might have tried to help the badly hurt Jacqueline. It was a macabre thing for small children to say while playing, and it deeply troubled Florence. She also heard Jillian scolding Jennifer once, referencing the same scene. Jillian told Jennifer not to look because you've got blood on your eyes. These were not typical childhood make-believe scenarios. They aligned far too closely with the tragic reality that had occurred. Both parents had been very careful not to describe the graphic aftermath of the accident to the twins. For them to speak of blood in head wounds in relation to a car was inexplicable and extremely eerie. In another instance, the twins were discussing injuries, and Jillian pointed to the birthmark on Jennifer's forehead, the one that matched Jacqueline's scar, and said, "That is the mark Jennifer got when she fell on a bucket." This statement again mirrors what happened to Jacqueline, the scar from falling into a bucket or onto a bucket as a child. Jillian spoke as if she had been present to witness that childhood accident. It was as though, in that moment, Jillian's mind carried Joanna's memory of her little sister's mishap. Jennifer, for her part, seemed to accept these statements as natural. It's not recorded that she was confused by Jillian's references. On the contrary, they sometimes talked about these past events together in a matter-of-fact tone, often using the present tense as if they were still living those moments. John would later note that when the twins talked about the accident between themselves, they did so almost as if it were happening in the present, which gave the impression that these might indeed be fragmented past life memories surfacing. Knowledge of family events and habits. Several episodes demonstrated that Jillian and Jennifer appeared to have knowledge of family specifics that they had not been told about. One striking example concerned a piece of clothing, Florence's old work smock. As mentioned earlier, Florence used to wear a particular long, dark-colored smock or overcoat when delivering milk on rounds with John. After the girls' deaths, she had stopped working on the delivery route and put that smock away in a closet, never to wear it again. Or so she thought. When the twins were about 4.5 years old, John needed a garment for doing some painting around the house, and he happened to pull out that old smock to use as a paint cover-up. He put it on and went about painting. Upon seeing her father in this coat, Jennifer spoke up in puzzlement. "Why are you wearing Mummy's coat?" Jennifer became agitated that Jillian didn't seem to recognize it, almost chiding her twin for not knowing something so obvious. This caught John off guard. The twins had never seen that smock before, as Florence hadn't worn it since before they were born, and certainly never after they were old enough to remember. John gently asked how Jennifer knew it was Mummy's coat. Jennifer replied that Mummy wore it while delivering milk. This was entirely true. something only Joanna and Jacqueline, who used to sometimes see their mother leaving in that attire, would have known in the context of the family. In fact, recall that Joanna, the older sister, would have been at school in the mornings by the time Florence started helping with deliveries, while Jacqueline, who was not yet school age, would have seen her mother wearing that garment more often. And it was Jennifer, the younger twin, who recognized the smock as Florence's, consistent with the idea that Jennifer carries Jacqueline's memories. Jillian, who would align with Joanna, did not recognize the code, just as Joanna might not have been as familiar with it. The correlation was exact and gave the adults goosebump. It's worth noting that Jennifer was quite annoyed at Jillian's ignorance, almost as if saying, "How can you not remember?" Which again is very peculiar dynamic if we think of them as children with no past. Another instance of apparent memory came during a family trip back to Hexham. The Pollocks had moved when the twins were infants, and they did not return to Hexham until the girls were about 4. When they finally visited their old hometown, something remarkable happened. As the family was walking through town, heading toward a local park, the twins suddenly ran ahead. Instead, they wanted to go to the park swings. This alone might not be odd, except that they were not yet in sight of the park when the girls indicated exactly where to go. Jillian and Jennifer navigated the streets as if they knew the way, even though they had never been taken to that park at an age they could remember. They left Hexham at less than 1 year old. John and Florence watched in astonishment as the twins confidently led the way to a playground that they should have been complete strangers to. They correctly knew what was across the road and around the bend, the location of the park, and the swing set that Joanna and Jacqueline used to love. In one version of this account, the park in question had even been remodeled or changed since Joanna and Jacqueline's time, making the recognition even more puzzling. Yet the twins seemed sure of where the swings had been. The parents had not mentioned the park during the walk. The girls initiated the idea and did so in a manner implying familiarity. It was as if returning to Hexham triggered latent memories in the children's minds, guiding them unawares to their old playground. In a similar vein, one day at home, the twins were complaining about the lunch their mother served. Perhaps in exasperation, Florence said that if they didn't like it, they could go have lunch at school instead. Jillian and Jennifer responded casually, "We've done that before," or "We've had school dinners already." This was an odd claim, since at 4 years old, neither twin had started school yet, let alone eat lunch at school. However, Joanna and Jacqueline had indeed eaten lunch at school, Joanna for sure at age 11, and Jacqueline possibly at the school nursery. It was a small detail, but it contributed to the pattern. The twins spoke as though they possessed knowledge and experiences belonging to their elder sisters. Eerie phobias and emotional echoes. Beyond direct statements, behaviors and emotional reactions in the twins provided further cause for wonder. Many of these behaviors uncannily paralleled those of Joanna and Jacqueline, almost as if specific personality traits and fears had carried over. Family members observed that Jillian and Jennifer, like their departed sisters, were extremely close to one another. Of course, twins often are close, but in this case, their relationship dynamic mirrored the earlier siblings' dynamic. Jillian, the older twin by 10 minutes, behaved in a protective, nurturing way towards Jennifer, and Jennifer was content to be directed or mothered by Jillian. This was precisely how Joanna had acted toward little Jacqueline. For example, Jillian from a young age took on a slightly more mature role in their play, often initiating games and comforting Jennifer when she was upset, just as Joanna once did. The twins would even enact scenarios where one was the older sibling caring for the other. To the Pollocks, it felt like watching history repeat itself within the new pair of girls. Moreover, the twins displayed preferences in adult company similar to their sisters. Despite Florence now being more available to raise them, having given up the delivery work, Jillian and Jennifer were inexplicably drawn to their maternal grandmother for comfort and guidance, just as Joanna and Jacqueline had been when the grandmother was their primary caregiver. This was unusual because typically, since Florence was at home, one might expect the twins to cling most to their mother. Yet, given the choice, they often sought out Grandma's attention, showing an emotional bond that seemed to carry over from the previous generation. The twins also enjoyed some of the same quirky activities that their sisters had. Both girls loved to comb their father's hair, giggling and playing barber, which was exactly what Joanna and Jacqueline used to do to John. It's a small, sweet behavior, but notable because it's somewhat unusual for multiple children to independently develop that exact same odd hobby, unless influenced. John hadn't encouraged it. Perhaps the most significant behavior parallel was their intense fear of cars. Given the violent way Joanna and Jacqueline died, one might expect any reincarnation of them to have some residual trauma. Indeed, from a toddler age, Jillian and Jennifer exhibited phobic reactions to moving cars. Florence noticed that whenever they walked near traffic, the girls were excessively cautious. They insisted on holding on to an adult's hands tightly and were very anxious crossing streets. Now, one could attribute that to Florence herself being extra careful, since she had lost children in a car accident. Surely she was very protective while crossing roads. Florence acknowledged that her own caution might have influenced them somewhat, but there were episodes that went beyond normal wariness. For example, one day, John was with the twins in a narrow alley when a car started its engine nearby. The sudden noise and vibration triggered a panic in the girls. They clung to each other and to John, crying out, the car, it's coming for us." And they were terrified, nearly hysterical. They pressed against a wall, as if expecting to be hit. This reaction was far more intense than a typical child's fear of loud engine. John felt that the girls in that moment were re-experiencing the scenario of the accident. Recall that in 1957, the children had been trapped by a wall as an oncoming car bore down. The twins' instinctive response to a car in a confined space was to cower against the wall and scream that it was coming to get them. That goes beyond learned behavior. It resembles a phobia rooted in trauma. And yet, these girls ostensibly never experienced a trauma with cars in their current lives. They had only been driven safely by family. So where did this come from? The Pollocks became convinced this fear was a carryover from the accident. Supporting that interpretation, the twins also reportedly had recurring nightmares about being in a road accident. They would wake up screaming about a car hitting them. Such nightmares would be unusual, unless they had been told about the accident, which the parents maintained they had not at that young age. It was as if the memory of that fatal event lurked in their subconscious, erupting in moments of stress or during sleep. Another behavioral quirk involved writing and fine motor skills. When the twins reached about 4 years old, they began to learn how to write their letters, likely by observing older siblings or with parental guidance. It was observed that Jillian immediately held a pencil properly, with a standard writing grip, whereas Jennifer instinctively held the pencil upright in her fist, an immature grip more common in very young children. No matter how much they tried to teach Jennifer the correct grip, she continued to hold the pencil in a clumsy fist manner until about age 7, when she finally adopted the usual grip. And even then, occasionally she would revert to the fist hold when not concentrating. This mirrored exactly the situation with the older girls. At the time of her death, 6-year-old Jacqueline had still been struggling with her pencil grip in school. Her teacher had actually informed Florence and John about Jacqueline's habit of holding pencils in her fist and suggested they correct it. The teacher even recommended gently slapping Jacqueline's hand to train her out of it, as was the style in those days. Joanna, being older, had long since learned the proper grip and wrote well for her age. Now, decades later, the pattern repeated. Jillian, the Joanna of this pair, had matured fine motor control. Jennifer did not. This is another characteristic that is hard to attribute to environment or genetics. Identical twins share the same developmental potential, and being raised in the same environment, one might expect them to have very similar progress in motor skills. The divergence here stood out, particularly because it lined up with the previous generation's difference. Dr. Ian Stevenson, who later analyzed this case, found this detail significant because it suggested that even specific learned habits or developmental delays might transfer from a past life. Finally, consider the physical appearance and build of the twins as they grew. Although Jillian and Jennifer were identical genetically, family and investigators noted subtle differences in their bodies that seemed to resemble the elder sisters. Joanna had been slim and had a slightly more splay-footed gait, whereas Jacqueline was a bit stockier and walked with a standard posture. As Jillian and Jennifer grew out of babyhood, Jillian's physique was more slender, like Joanna's, and Jennifer was a bit broader or stockier, like Jacqueline. Even the way they walked purportedly differed slightly in the same way. Normally, identical twins are extremely similar in build and movement, especially when young. So seeing these divergent traits reflect the deceased sisters gave further pause. The family could hardly chalk it up to coincidence, given everything else. Summarizing these observations, we see a compelling picture. Each twin, in many ways, took after one of the deceased sisters. Jillian exhibited the temperament, behavior, and even some memories that correspond to the older sister Joanna. Jennifer did the same with respect to Jacqueline. Importantly, these signs manifested spontaneously. John and Florence asserted that they did not tell the twins about Joanna and Jacqueline's lives during those early years. The twins' statements and reactions often caught them by surprise. In private, John became more and more convinced that his belief had been right all along, that his prayers had been answered, and his beloved daughters had come back. Florence, while still more reserved about the idea, could not find a ready explanation for many of the incidents she herself witnessed. She would sometimes sternly tell John not to indulge the topic, but even she had to admit some events were uncanny. By the early 1960s, the Pollock case was developing into something extraordinary, enough so that it began to attract outside attention. Before moving on to how researchers got involved, let us pause and emphasize the physical signs one more time, as they represent a core part of the evidence. To recap, Jennifer's birthmark were a central pillar of John's claim. One matched Jacqueline's scar on the forehead, another matched her birthmark on the waist. These are facts recorded at birth. Stevenson and others noted that such a precise replication of a scar, especially one from an injury sustained later in life, is exceedingly hard to explain by genetics or random chance. Jennifer and Gillian were monozygotic twins, meaning if genetics were the cause of such marks, both twins should show them. Gillian had none, and Jennifer had two, exactly where Jacqueline had them. The idea of maternal impression, an old hypothesis that a pregnant mother's thoughts or experiences can physically mark a fetus, doesn't fit well here either, since Florence did not believe in reincarnation, and thus wasn't expecting or imagining such marks on her babies. She certainly wasn't fixated on Jacqueline's scar in a way that might psychologically imprint it on a fetus. Stevenson even speculated about the fringe possibility of a paternal impression, joking that perhaps John's intense belief somehow physically influenced the development of the fetus. But this was more a thought experiment than a serious theory. In Stevenson's assessment, the birthmarks combined with the knowledge and behaviors formed a cohesive argument that reincarnation offered the most straightforward explanation for the Pollock twin case. However, before we conclude anything, it's time to consider how this case was formally studied. The Pollock's private experiences became known to a prominent researcher, leading to investigations that further documented these phenomena. We will now turn to the scientific investigation, spearheaded by Dr. Ian Stevenson, and later developments as the twins grew up. Chapter 3. Investigation by Dr. Ian Stevenson. By the early 1960s, words of the extraordinary happenings in the Pollock family had begun to spread beyond their immediate circle. It's been noted that newspaper coverage in 1963 first brought the case to wider attention. An article or report about the twins' supposed memories and birthmarks circulated, eventually catching the eye of one of the few scientists in the world who would take such a story seriously, Dr. Ian Stevenson. Ian Stevenson was a psychiatrist and professor at the University of Virginia who had developed a passionate interest in investigating claims of children with past life memories. By that time, Stevenson had begun traveling the world to record and analyze such cases in a rigorous way. He was looking for evidence that might validate the idea of reincarnation under scientific scrutiny. Stevenson was intrigued by the Pollock case as soon as he heard of it. Here was a case not in faraway India or Sri Lanka, where many cases arose, but in Britain, a modern Western setting, involving twins, which was rare, and with clear physical marks to investigate. In Stevenson's view, it had several elements that made it worthy of in-depth study. Stevenson first reached out to the Pollocks in 1963 and arranged to meet them. In late 1963, when Gillian and Jennifer were about 4 years old, Dr. Stevenson traveled to England to meet the family in Whitley Bay. He interviewed John and Florence at length. carefully recording their accounts of everything the twins had said or done that seemed related to the previous lives. Importantly, he also examined the twins' birthmarks in person. Stevenson checked the mark on Jennifer's forehead and compared it with medical records or descriptions of Jacqueline's scar, and likewise noted the birthmark on Jennifer's waist and confirmed it matched Florence's memory of Jacqueline's mark. He likely took photographs and detailed notes, as was his method. One reason Stevenson wanted to get involved early, when the twins were 4, was to observe the case while the memories were reportedly still active. In many cases he studied, the window of ages 2 to 5 was key, and by age 7 or 8 the memories fade, so timing was critical. After the 1963 visit, Dr. Stevenson maintained correspondence with the Pollocks and tracked the twins' development. He visited again a few years later in 1967, when the twins were around 8 or 9. By then, as we will see, their past life memories were waning, which is itself typical, but Stevenson wanted to document the arc. He also likely spoke with other relatives or anyone who could corroborate the parents' testimony. Stevenson was very aware of the potential for bias or fabrication, so he tried to get multiple witnesses where possible. However, in this case, the only direct witnesses to the children's statements were essentially John and Florence, and occasionally the grandmother. That would later become a point of criticism, but Stevenson had to work with what was available. Years later, in 1978, Stevenson made another trip to see the Pollocks. By that time, Gillian and Jennifer were 20 years old, adults. The purpose of that visit was partly to wrap up the case with final interviews, and surprisingly, Stevenson arranged for a blood test to confirm the twins' zygosity. The test indeed showed that Gillian and Jennifer were monozygotic twins, confirming that genetically they started from the same blueprint. This was significant for his analysis because, as noted, it ruled out genetic explanations for any differences like birthmarks. During that 1978 visit, Stevenson interviewed the twins themselves, now that they were grown, to see what they recalled or believed about their own childhood statements. Tragically, by the late 1970s, the family had experienced more changes. Florence Pollock passed away in 1979, and John remarried not long after. Stevenson's correspondence indicates that he stayed in touch with John up until the mid-1980s. John Pollock eventually died in 1985, but before John's death in 1982, Stevenson visited again, meeting John and John's new wife, as well as speaking to Gillian once more. So over roughly 2 decades, Stevenson kept a close eye on this case, gathering data at multiple points. Stevenson went on to include the Pollock twins case in several of his publications. He wrote a detailed case report in Volume 2 of Reincarnation in Biology, a contribution to the etiology of birthmarks and birth defects, 1997, which was a massive 2-volume work focused on cases with physical signs like birthmarks. In that report, pages 2041 to 2058 were dedicated to the Pollocks. He also summarized the case in his book, Children Who Remember Previous Lives, first edition 1987, and in European Cases of the Reincarnation Type, 2003. In short, Stevenson treated the Pollocks case as one of his most important Western examples and referenced it multiple times in support of various analyses. Stevenson's findings and impressions. From Stevenson's perspective, the Pollock case yielded a number of notable findings. Verification of parents' reports. In interviewing John and Florence, Stevenson found them to be sincere, and the details they provided about the twins' statements were consistent over time. He noted down each incident: toys, smock, park, accident talks, and often was able to match it with either the older girl's known history or independent corroboration. For example, he verified through medical or family records the presence of Jacqueline's scar and the teacher's note about pencil holding. Stevenson confirmed that the twins did make those statements as far as could be determined, but he also realized all testimony was from the family itself, which meant the evidence, while intriguing, was not coming from neutral third parties. This would temper how he presented the strength of the case, but it didn't diminish the strangeness of the events. Birthmarks and physical correspondences. Stevenson placed heavy emphasis on the physical evidence. He carefully documented Jennifer's 2 birthmarks and pointed out that genetics could not account for them, given Jillian's lack of them. He also remarked on the twins' builds and gait differences paralleling Joanna and Jacqueline. In one of his works, he mentioned that out of 895 cases in his collection, with an identified previous person, about 35% featured birthmarks or birth defects corresponding to wounds, scars, or marks on that previous person. The Pollock case was part of that statistic, albeit an unusual part, since the mark corresponded to a non-fatal scar. Stevenson felt these data points added credence to the idea that something of the physical body might carry over or be replicated in a reincarnation scenario. Lack of normal explanations. Stevenson carefully considered and later wrote about alternative normal explanations. We will discuss these in the next section on criticisms. In his initial investigation notes, he was aware that one parent, John, strongly believed in reincarnation. This raised the question, could John have inadvertently fed information to the twins, or interpreted their actions in a biased way? Stevenson asked John and Florence about this. John insisted that he never spoke to the twins about their late sisters during the early years, and that he certainly never mentioned reincarnation around them when they were little. In fact, the twins reportedly did not even learn about the concept of reincarnation until age 13, around 1971, when they read or were told about it explicitly. Up to that point, they apparently did not claim outright, "I am Joanna" or "I am Jacqueline." They simply displayed behaviors and made statements that others interpreted as such. Stevenson took John at his word on the matter, though he remained aware of the possibility of unconscious cues. Stevenson also considered whether the twins might have overheard family conversations or picked up knowledge through normal means. The Pollocks had older sons, the girls' brothers, who certainly remembered Joanna and Jacqueline. Could the twins have heard their brothers or other relatives talking about the deceased sisters? The family said they tried not to bring it up in front of them, but no family can be completely silent. Stevenson noted that since the 2 sets of children shared the same household and relatives, some information might have seeped through. However, he found some instances, like the recognition of the smock and the specific accident reenactment with blood, hard to attribute to mere overhearing. These were not the kind of details people discuss casually around toddlers, especially given how upsetting the subject was to Florence. The grandparents and extended family also claimed they didn't talk about the tragedy in front of the twins. The twins' own perspective. When Stevenson spoke to Gillian and Jennifer as they got older, teenagers and then young adults, he was interested in how they viewed the events. In 1978, at age 20, both twins told him they remembered nothing of having past life memories as children. This is actually quite common in Stevenson's cases. The children forget the content of their earlier statements by the time they reach adolescence. The Pollock twins were no exception. By their 20s, they relied on what their parents told them had happened in early childhood, rather than any retained personal memories. They did accept their parents' belief that they were the reincarnations of their sisters. How could they not, given all the stories? But interestingly, Stevenson noted they showed only mild skepticism about reincarnation in general. In other words, they weren't zealots or even very enthusiastic about the idea. Our parents think we are our sisters reborn, and we're open to that being true for us, but we're not sure what we think about reincarnation overall. This is in line with their upbringing in a predominantly Christian culture, where reincarnation isn't a default belief. One potential significant exception occurred in 1981, when Gillian, around 23 years old, had a series of what she described as inner visions, or vivid mental images. In these visions, she saw herself as a child playing in a sandpit in the garden of a house in Wickham with her older brothers. She described the house, garden, and orchard in details which matched perfectly the property in Wickham where the Pollocks had lived until Joanna was 4 years old, and long before Gillian or Jennifer were born. Gillian had never been to the house in her lifetime. The family had moved from Wickham to Hexham years before her birth, yet she was able to describe features of it accurately. Stevenson took this as a delayed recall of Joanna's memories. It was like an echo that came much later, perhaps triggered by something subconscious. Gillian's experience suggested that even after the usual childhood window, some latent memory might still reside and occasionally surface under the right conditions. This incident further strengthened John and Stevenson's belief in the reincarnation hypothesis, though it occurred well after Stevenson's main period of study and after John's death. Stevenson's conclusion. In his writing, Stevenson was careful but clearly leaned toward seeing the Pollock case as supportive of reincarnation. He noted that although the evidence was not as ironclad as some cases where numerous facts about an unrelated previous person could be verified, the Pollock case had its own strengths. He famously commented that he found it inconceivable that John and Florence could have coached the twins so precisely mimicked the previous children's behavior and memories. He believed no parents could mold two young children's personalities and fears to that extent, even if they tried. Particularly, he highlighted the combination of birthmarks, behavioral similarities, and recognitions as being beyond normal explanation. In one analysis, Stevenson compared the Pollock twins to another case of monozygotic twins, a case from Sri Lanka of twins named Indika and Kakshapa, where past life differences also manifested. He suggested that these twin cases provided some of the strongest evidence for reincarnation because they circumvent many genetic and environmental counterarguments. Identical genes remove genetic influence. Same family reduces but also complicates environmental influence. In short, Stevenson felt the Pollock case was a suggestive case of reincarnation, meaning it strongly suggested but perhaps did not absolutely prove it. He knew critics would and did raise objections, but he maintained that this case, among others, was best explained by the survival of personality after death and rebirth in a new body. Stevenson's investigation brought an academic legitimacy to the Pollock story. Through the 1960s and 1970s, it became one of the most cited Western cases in discussions of reincarnation. It stood out because many of the other cases in Stevenson's catalog were from cultures where reincarnation is an accepted idea. Skeptics often argue those might be culturally influenced, but here was an English family with a Christian background, having a reincarnation-like experience without seeking it. That made people wonder if such phenomena were more universal than assumed. However, not everyone was convinced. With publicity and Stevenson's endorsement also came scrutiny and criticism. We will now examine the alternative explanations and skeptical viewpoints that have been offered, including some recent revelations from within the Pollock family itself that cast the story in a different light. Chapter 4: The Twins Grow Up. Before diving into the critical analyses, it's worth completing the narrative of Gillian and Jennifer's later development. As mentioned, by around age 5 to 7, the twins' unusual memories and behaviors faded. This corresponds to a common pattern documented in many children who report past life memories. They tend to lose those memories as they become more engrossed in their current life and approach school age. In the Pollock's twins' case, once the twins surpassed the age at which Joanna and Jacqueline died, 11 and 6 respectively, they appear to settle fully into the present. By the early 1960s, after the family's return visit to Hexham and the initial flurry of strange incidents, no new past life memories were noted. John Pollock, true to his word, did not prompt the twins or remind them of their earlier statements as they grew older. He worried that talking too much about it might interfere with the natural process or make the girls self-conscious. In fact, John did not even teach them about reincarnation doctrine while they were young. The twins only learned what reincarnation meant around the age of 13, probably when they encountered news of their own case or were told about it in context. The family did eventually explain to them that many people believe they were their sisters reborn, which the twins reportedly found interesting but not consuming. During their school years, Gillian and Jennifer led fairly normal lives. They had friends, went to school, and the past life topic was not an everyday matter. Their classmates or teachers didn't treat them oddly to our knowledge. The case was famous in paranormal circles, but not broadly known in their community, except perhaps local gossip. The girls did well and continued to be close to each other and their family. After losing their mother Florence in 1979, the twins were about 21 years old and likely entering adulthood with normal aspirations. When Stevenson interviewed them in 1978 and again in 1982, both twins confessed that they could not remember actually making the statements or having the memories that were attributed to them in early childhood. They did not personally recall being the ones who recognized the toys or spoke of the accident. They only knew those things had happened because their parents had told them so later. This is consistent with the idea that whatever mechanism allowed these memories to manifest has since gone dormant. The twins did say that they accepted their parents' belief about who they had been, though they themselves were not zealously claiming I am Joanna or I am Jacqueline. They seemed, by Stevenson's account, a bit skeptical, or at least open-minded but not fully convinced about reincarnation in general. In essence, they were polite about it, acknowledging that something unusual happened when we were young and that our parents interpreted it as reincarnation. They were not campaigning the story, nor did they deny it. They simply moved on. As adults, the twins remained very close. Jillian married and had children, and Jennifer also likely married or at least lived her life outside the limelight. Public information on Jennifer's later life is scarce, as she largely stayed private. In a poignant turn, Jillian Pollock tragically passed away in 2002 at the age of 44. The cause of her death is not public, but it was an untimely loss for the family. Jennifer, as of the latest account, mid-2020s, is still alive. She would be in her mid-60s now, possibly living quietly in the UK. The Pollock twins had effectively vanished from public discussions for many years. After Stevenson's publications, there wasn't much follow-up in the mainstream. That is, until recently, when a renewed interest brought back their story into focus, and with it, some surprising new information came to light. Before we discuss those recent revelations, let's wrap up this section by noting how the Pollock twins case fits into the larger context of child past life memory cases. It is often cited as a classic example, even though in some ways it's atypical. Most of Stevenson's strongest cases involve a child in culture A recalling a life in culture B, often with verifiable facts that the child couldn't have normally known, names, places, how they died. The Pollock case did not involve unknown facts being verified. Everyone knew who the previous personalities were from the start. This makes it less useful as proof in the scientific case because one can argue the information was available normally. Family photos, stories, even if unintentionally conveyed. What made the Pollock case stand out were the physical and behavioral correspondences in the context of John's prediction. It's also worth noting that the Pollock case is sometimes misrepresented in summaries. For instance, many websites and videos erroneously illustrate the story with a famous photograph of a creepy identical twins taken by Diane Arbus in 1967, who are not the Pollock twins at all. This has led to confusion. Some think the Pollock twin story is an urban legend illustrated by a spooky photo. In reality, genuine photos of Jillian and Jennifer exist, showing them as blonde girls with blue eyes, often wearing similar outfits. The conflation with the Arbus photo is just an internet age mix-up that the family themselves have commented on. Jennifer Pollock, when shown that creepy photo, laughed and confirmed that's not us at all. A reminder that as stories circulate, facts can get distorted. Chapter 5. Debates and Theories. From the moment the Pollock case became known, people have debated, is this really evidence of reincarnation, or could there be other explanations for these uncanny events? We will examine all major theories, from the mundane to the extraordinary, that have been proposed to explain the Pollock twins. Theory 1. Parental influence and wishful thinking. One of the simplest explanations is that the Pollock parents, consciously or not, influenced the twins' behavior and memories due to their own grief and beliefs. John Pollock's role in particular is scrutinized. He was a devout believer in reincarnation and had even prayed for evidence. It's plausible, skeptics argue, that John saw what he wanted to see in his twins, filtering their normal childhood remarks through a lens of reincarnation. For example, toddlers often say curious or surprising things. John, being primed to expect his daughters back, may have latched onto any statement that even remotely suggested past knowledge. A critic might say, if a typical child says, "I've done that before," in response to something, most parents brush it off as imagination or confusion. But John might take it very seriously and record it as evidence. Thus, confirmation bias is a big consideration. Stevenson himself was aware that virtually all evidence in this case was coming from the parents, and John had a strong motive. Could John and Florence have actively or subconsciously guided the twins to act out the roles of their sisters? Some have suspected that John might have engaged in what we'd call selective reinforcement. That means if the twins ever said or did something that aligned with Joanna or Jacqueline, John would reward them with attention and praise, reinforcing it. If they did something contradicting that narrative, perhaps he ignored it. Over time, the twins might learn to behave in ways that please their father. This wouldn't even require a deliberate plan by John. It could happen subtly. Direct coaching is another possibility raised. Did John or Florence ever outright tell the twins about their sisters when they were small? The Pollocks say no, but skeptics are not fully convinced. It's possible that in unguarded moments, stories of when Joanna and Jacqueline were alive were spoken in the household. Children are keen listeners and can pick up information even when adults think they aren't paying attention. In a small town community, neighbors and friends might have mentioned the tragedy in the girl's presence too. The strongest form of this accusation is that John fabricated or exaggerated the claims. Ian Wilson, a British writer who examined reincarnation cases, pointed out that all evidence here comes second-hand from the parents, and given John's obsession, there's no way that bias didn't enter into his narrative, unconsciously or consciously. In plainer terms, John might have been lying or embellishing some anecdotes to fit his story. For example, when the twins divided the toys, is it possible John and Florence guided them? Like, oh, this one was yours and that one was your sister's. And the toddlers simply went along. The parents claim the children did it spontaneously, but we have only their word. Could the statement about the accident have been misremembered or even invented after the fact? Memory is fallible, especially when filtered through emotion and time. It's also worth noting that the case didn't become public until the twins were 4. That leaves a few years where, if John were so inclined, he could have subtly shaped a narrative before telling anyone. We do know that John was very enthusiastic about the case once it got out. Stevenson noted that John said if he hadn't believed in reincarnation, he might not have even reported these events. That ironically suggests that his belief was a driving factor in sharing and thus creating the case as a case. He basically admitted belief came first, case came second, in terms of making it known. A journalist who interviewed John at some point apparently suggested that he had primed the kids, and John's answer was, "Had I not believed in reincarnation, I wouldn't have told anybody about the similarities." Some take this as a candid acknowledgement that belief framed the whole thing. Decades later, a recent investigation uncovered testimony from within the Pollock family that added weight to this skeptical view, the 2024 Extrasensory podcast. John's own granddaughters, Liza and Joanna, children of the Pollocks' older sons, have spoken about John in unflattering terms. They describe John Pollock as controlling, coercive, and physically violent man in the family. They allege that he bullied his wife Florence into going along with his beliefs, essentially that she had no choice but to play along with his reincarnation narrative because of his domineering nature. If true, this paints the story in a different light. Perhaps Florence's account were influenced by fear or pressure, and John might have been willing to impose his version of events forcefully. The granddaughters refer to John as not a reliable witness, given his behavior. These are harsh claims and cannot be verified now that John, Florence, and that generation have passed. However, it is telling that people in the family kept this a secret for decades, possibly due to shame or trauma. Interestingly, Jennifer Pollock, the surviving twin, when confronted with these allegations about her father, gave a different perspective. She remembers John as a loving, doting father who would never resort to violence against them or Florence. According to Jennifer, John adored his princesses, as he called the twins, and was a gentle man with them. So why the stark difference? It could be that John mellowed in his later years, or treated his daughters differently from his sons' families. It might also suggest that the truth lies somewhere in between. John may have been intense and single-minded, even overbearing about reincarnation, but not necessarily a monster to his immediate children. Regardless of family dynamics, the fundamental skeptical claim remains. The Pollock case could be a product of parental imprinting rather than true past life recall. The twins, being identical and very wanted, might have picked up on their parents' desire to see their lost sisters in them, and subconsciously fulfilled those expectations. Children are highly suggestible, and even nonverbal cues can reinforce behavior. Proponents of reincarnation interpretation respond that many of the twins' actions were spontaneous and unexpected. They argue that if John had been coaching the kids, it likely would have come out under Stevenson's questioning or later reflections. The twins themselves as adults never claimed their parents prompted them. In fact, Jennifer maintains a positive view of her father, implying he didn't manipulate them overtly. Also, not all incidents can be easily chalked up to suggestion. For instance, the forehead birthmark on Jennifer cannot be a result of suggestion. It was present from birth. Even the staunchest skeptics has to admit John couldn't fabricate that physical fact. So while parental influence might explain certain behaviors or statements, it doesn't explain why Jennifer's body carried the unique markers of Jacqueline's. At best, skeptics can call that a coincidence. Another counterpoint. If John were knowingly lying or fabricating, why didn't he publicize the case more himself? It wasn't until others took interest that it became widely known. John shared with a local reporter in Stevenson, but he didn't say write a book or go on a publicity tour to prove he was right. One could see that as either him being genuine or clever. Interpretations vary by one's inclination. The parental influence theory remains one of the major alternative explanations, and it rightly emphasizes caution. Human memory and bias can shape narratives profoundly. This theory doesn't completely debunk the case, but it raises the possibility that the Pollock story is not as clear-cut as it appears through Stevenson's recounting. Theory 2. Cryptamnesia or normal knowledge. Related to parental influence, but distinct, is the idea of cryptamnesia, or simply normal memory at work. Cryptomnesia means a person unknowingly recalls information that they don't consciously remember learning. In children, this could happen if the twins overheard stories about their sisters or saw photographs and later, when playing, their minds wove those into memories without realizing they were actually just regurgitating input. For instance, maybe one day a family friend visited and reminisced about how Joanna used to love the park swings. With the twins in earshot, the twins might absorb that, and months later, upon seeing Hexam, their subconscious guides them to the park because it's been planted in their memory. They would seem to know the way, but really it was the memory from hearing someone mention it. Small children, especially, might not distinguish between something they heard and something they experienced. It was mentioned that Joanna and Jacqueline's toys were stored in the attic. What if at some point before age 3, the twins stumbled upon those toys or heard someone refer to them as belonging to Joanna and Jacqueline? Even if they didn't consciously remember, it might have stuck. So when the toys were officially presented, it felt like recognition, but could have been an unconscious familiarity. Skeptic Richard Rockley suggested that not just the parents but other family members and friends might have talked about the accident and the deaths in the children's presence. In a tight-knit community suffering a tragedy, it's plausible. People in town remarked on it, perhaps even thinking the twins as babies wouldn't understand. Rockley also pointed out that given the girls lived in the same family, they might have seen photographs of Joanna and Jacqueline at some point, or come across their belongings earlier than the parents realized. If there was a photo of Florence in her milk delivery smock in a photo album, maybe Jennifer saw it, and that image stayed with her until she saw the smock in reality. Children can also pick up a lot from tone and emotional energy. They might not have been explicitly told, "Your sisters died when a car hit them," but they could sense fear around cars from how the adults reacted. Indeed, Florence admitted she was very cautious with them near roads. So they could have learned to fear cars from her nervous hand-holding, without knowing exactly why. Their imagination then supplied the cars coming to get us based on a child's interpretation of the anxiety they felt around them. Counter-arguments to this theory are that the believers respond that some of the information was very specific and unlikely to have been available to the twins. For example, would anyone have told a 3-year-old that there was blood coming out of your sister's eyes? That's not a detail people generally share at all, let alone around small children. The fact that Gillian described the head wound in such a graphic way is either a remarkable lucky guess or a true past life memory. It wasn't publicized in detail. News report wouldn't mention blood out of eyes, they'd just say killed instantly. Only John, who identified the bodies, and perhaps the undertaker or doctor, would know that gruesome detail. It's possible John mentioned it to Florence or family in grief, but would a toddler overhear that and reenact it? It strains credulity a bit. Also, some details, like Jennifer's pencil grip habit matching Jacqueline's, is hard to attribute to memory. That's a neurodevelopmental quirk. It's not like someone told Jennifer Jacqueline held her pencil wrong, and then Jennifer copied it. At 4, kids just hold pencils however it comes naturally. The natural way for Jennifer happened to be the way Jacqueline did, despite Gillian doing it correctly from the start. Suggestion can't easily account for that. It suggests something internal or physical linking Jennifer to Jacqueline. Theory 3. Maternal impression and prenatal influences. One interesting theory, proposed by Ian Wilson in 1982, is the idea of maternal impression. This is an old concept, largely discredited in modern science, that a pregnant woman's strong thoughts, fears, or experiences can somehow physically or psychologically imprint on her developing fetus. Wilson speculated that Florence Pollock, during pregnancy, must have constantly thought about her lost daughters, replaying their lives and tragic deaths in her mind, perhaps even dreaming of them. These intense ruminations, according to the theory, might have influenced the babies in utero, leading to both birthmarks and later behaviors reminiscent of the lost girls. In the Victorian era, maternal impression was commonly invoked to explain birthmarks. For example, a woman frightened by a fire might give birth to a child with red birthmark. While science now attributes birthmarks to genetic or random developmental factors, Wilson's suggestion was essentially a modern twist on this thought. Florence's profound grief and guilt somehow marked Jennifer and Jacqueline's scars and imbued the twins with psychological echoes of their sisters. From a psychological standpoint, one might recast maternal impression as simply the mother's postnatal influence. Perhaps Florence's unspoken feelings permeated the household. Babies are very attuned to their mother's emotions. If Florence held the twins and silently thought of them as Joanna and Jacqueline reborn, maybe subtle cues could encourage the twins to take on those identities as they grew. However, there's a big flaw in applying maternal impression here. Florence did not believe in reincarnation at the time and actively avoided thinking about her dead daughters during pregnancy. In fact, the pregnancy initially caused tension because John kept insisting the girls would be back, and Florence reportedly rejected that idea strongly. If anything, Florence tried not to dwell on Joanna and Jacqueline while carrying the new baby. She likely did think of them sometimes, how could a mother not? But if maternal impression requires a kind of open channel of belief or desire, Florence was not participating in that. Wilson's maternal impression theory acknowledges this, but he still thought the sheer emotional energy of her loss might have impressed the fetuses. As mentioned, Stevenson half-jokingly mused that perhaps John's intense belief could have influenced things in a paranormal way. This is even less grounded in known science, but it shows the lengths to which one might go to find an explanation, short of full reincarnation. However, even Ian Wilson concedes that maternal impression can't account for many classic reincarnation cases, especially those where the previous person is unrelated and distant. The mother couldn't have known those details. It was an attempt to explain Pollock specifically because it was same family. For Pollock, maternal impression feels like a stretch. It's basically reincarnation by another name, attributing it to psychological influence rather than actual soul transfer. But without a mechanism, it's almost mystical itself. Also, maternal impression wouldn't obviously cause a child to know where a park is or fear cars, unless one posits some telepathic link where the mother's memories are shared. Florence, however, didn't have the memories of the girl's perspective, so how would the twins act that way? All told, maternal impression is not a widely embraced explanation today, but it's noteworthy that a skeptic like Wilson preferred it to reincarnation since it kept everything in one family biologically, even if it invoked some unusual process. Theory 4. Coincidence and genetic factors. Some skeptics reduce the case to a series of coincidences, amplified by interpretation. They argue that none of the individual elements are impossible or even highly improbable on their own. It's not unheard of for a child to have a birthmark that looks like a scar, or for siblings to have birthmarks in similar spots. Perhaps Jacqueline's forehead scar was pure coincidence matched by Jennifer's birthmark. The fact it was identical in placement is striking, but with millions of people, coincidences do happen. Skeptics might point out cases like families with similar birthmarks by chance, or known genetic factors causing nevi or moles to appear on similar areas, though identical twins usually both have or both don't have such marks. One could say maybe the embryo split in such a way that only one twin got a cluster of pigment cells. It's unlikely, but not impossible. So they chalk the birthmark up to random chance. The world is big, strange alignments occur. Identical twins often have some differences despite the same genes. Family dynamics can cause one twin to take on an older sibling role even if only minutes older. Jillian was the firstborn. Often firstborn twins act a tad more dominant or mature. Jennifer, being more dependent, could just be natural twin dynamics, or even a reaction to how their parents treat them. Maybe they coddled Jennifer a bit more knowing she was the Jacqueline one unconsciously. Also, siblings in the same household often imitate older siblings they've heard about or seen pictures of. Maybe the twins were told stories, like Joanna used to love acting in plays. So Jillian, hearing that as a little girl, tries play acting too, not because she remembers, but because she idolizes the sister she never met. This would be an example of social or family conditioning rather than memory. Skeptics would handle the thought of memories like the park and accident talk by suggesting the children heard about these things somehow, or that the account might be exaggerated. Perhaps the kids did recognize the park, but one could argue maybe the parents talked about going to the park as they approached it, and the kids ran ahead. Later, the story gets remembered as they knew it before it was in view. Human memory is notoriously fallible. The accident reenactment is harder to dismiss, but one might question, did it happen exactly as reported? There's no recording, just Florence's recollection. She was deeply grieving. Could she have misinterpreted some grim play acting, or even misremembered the words over time? In essence, the coincidence theory says each element of the Pollock case can be explained by normal means, and it's only when you weave them together into a narrative that it seems uncanny. Remove the narrative, and it's a handful of curiosities that aren't strong evidence. Proponents of the paranormal will argue that while any one aspect might be coincidental, the combination strains probability. What are the chances of all those coincidences aligning in one pair of twins? It's the cumulative weight that they say points to something beyond chance. A counter analogy might be hitting a single number in a lottery is chance, but hitting multiple related numbers might indicate a pattern. At what point do we say too many coincidences and consider another explanation? Believers feel Pollock crosses that threshold. Skeptics are generally more comfortable chalking things up to chance when controlled evidence is lacking. Theory 5. The reincarnation hypothesis. Finally, we address the theory that John Pollock himself espoused, reincarnation, that Joanna and Jacqueline's souls or consciousness were reborn in the bodies of Jillian and Jennifer. Under this hypothesis, the remarkable birthmarks, behaviors, and memories are exactly what they appear to be, carryovers from a past life. From a reincarnation perspective, The Pollock case is a textbook example of a same family reincarnation. Such cases, while not the majority in the literature, do occur. Often, they are reported when a child seems to remember being a deceased older sibling or relative. Advocates would point out the following in favor of reincarnation. The timing fits. Reincarnation lore often suggests that souls may reborn relatively soon, especially if death was sudden and the soul has unfinished business or a strong desire. Joanna and Jacqueline died in May 1957. Jillian and Jennifer were born 17 months later in October 1958. In many cases studied by Stevenson, the interval between death and rebirth can be as short as a few months up to a few years. This is well within that range. John's prayer and conviction might not just be wishful thinking. If reincarnation is real, perhaps his strong intention called the souls back. Some spiritual theories suggest that desire or love can attract souls to be reborn to the same parents. It's a metaphysical idea, but John's foresight could be seen as an intuitive knowing. He felt it so strongly that many find it hard to label it mere coincidence that he was right. The birthmark on Jennifer aligning with Jacqueline's marks are taken as classic signs. In Stevenson's catalog, about 35% of cases where a past person is identified have birthmarks or birth defects that match wounds or features of that past person. He documented cases of children born with birthmarks corresponding to bullet wounds, knife wounds, surgical scars. The Pollock case fits that pattern, with one twist being the scar was not from the death, but from an earlier injury. Still, Stevenson notes that while it's more common to see the fatal wound mark, other notable marks can transfer, albeit more rarely. That Jennifer had two marks exactly where Jacqueline had them is seen as a double confirmation. And the fact they were identical twins, yet only Jennifer bore them, might be interpreted as the soul influence on the developing body, an idea that the mind or soul can influence the physical form. The specific knowledge the twins showed, like knowing the way to the park or recalling the accident, is direct evidence of memory continuity. Especially compelling is when twins acted out or spoke in ways far beyond their age. Stevenson often pointed out that the simplest explanation for a child knowing things they simply could not have learned normally is to accept they experienced it themselves in a previous life. In the Pollock case, although the information was within the family, some details arguably were not accessible to the twins by normal means. The pencil grip habit and personality parallels likewise suggest continuity of habits and temperament from one life to the next, which is a common theme in reincarnation research. For example, Stevenson reported many cases where children retained phobias related to their past life mode of death. Pollock twins' car phobia fits that model well. In the way one twin was more outgoing and older, and the other more dependent, aligns with how personalities can carry over, even influencing physical mannerisms like gait and playstyle. The later life flash that Jillian had at 23, envisioning a place from Joanna's early childhood, gives a final piece of evidence supporting reincarnation. It's as if even after the normal memory window closed, some deep memory emerged under certain conditions, pointing to knowledge beyond her current life's experiences. The reincarnation hypothesis ties together all the disparate phenomena in one framework. Instead of needing a separate explanation for birthmarks, another from memories. They all stem from the same source. It's a parsimonious explanation in that sense. Stevenson argued that for cases like Pollock, reincarnation provides the most straightforward and comprehensive explanation of the data. Naturally, mainstream science doesn't accept reincarnation because it violates many principles about mind and brain, and there's no known mechanism for a soul to leave one body at death and attach to a fetus. Skeptics often demand something like a verified past life memory with specific facts that could not be known as stronger evidence. In Pollock, because it's the same family, skeptics think it's not as airtight as, say, a child in India giving 40 correct statements about a stranger's life. So while believers see Pollock as a strong reincarnation case, many in the scientific community would say it's suggestive at best and only convincing if you already give credence to the idea. Another issue is, if reincarnation is real and common, why don't we see more cases? In cultures that believe in it, they claim to find many cases. Maybe Western culture suppresses it. The Pollock case might be rare, or maybe others have happened but gone unreported. It's an open question. The twins themselves in later life didn't strongly advocate, yes, we are our sisters reborn. They accepted it, but were skeptical generally. Some could say if anyone would know for sure, it should be them, and if they themselves aren't 100% convinced, that gives one pause. But others say that that's normal, because those early memories faded. So of course, as adults, they don't remember being Joanna or Jacqueline directly. In sum, the reincarnation hypothesis remains a matter of belief. To John Pollock and to Ian Stevenson, the pieces fit too neatly to ignore. To others, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and they feel Pollock, while intriguing, doesn't conclusively prove souls were reborn. It's an interpretive story that aligns with that view if you're inclined. After all analysis, definitive proof remains elusive. The Pollock twins' story lives at the intersection of faith, anecdote, and investigation. It has become a classic not because it's ironclad, but because it's richly detailed and forces us to confront how we interpret unusual events, through the lens of belief or through the lens of skepticism. In a meditative sense, one might say the Pollock case, whatever the truth, offers a narrative of hope and healing. For John and Florence, believing their daughters returned was immensely comforting. It turned their despair into purpose. And indeed, raising Jillian and Jennifer gave them a second chance at parenthood. Whether or not one believes they literally got their girls back, the story can be seen as one of love enduring beyond death, a notion that can be psychologically healing. Perhaps that is why it resonates. It speaks to deep wishes about life, death, and connection. Chapter 6: Legacy and Recent Investigations. The Pollock twins' case has remained a touchstone in reincarnation lore for decades. It is often cited in books, documentaries, and YouTube videos and podcasts as one of the most intriguing unexplained cases. For believers in the paranormal, it's a heartwarming example that maybe death is not the end, and that family bonds can reunite souls. For skeptics, it's a cautionary tale about wishful thinking and the power of suggestion. This duality has kept the discussion alive. In the years after Stevenson's publications, the case didn't receive a lot of new attention. It was written about in paranormal compilations and skeptical rebuttals, but the family themselves stayed mostly private. As mentioned, Jillian's passing in 2002 was not widely reported. It only came to light in the context of a recent re-examination of the story. That re-examination came in the form of a 2024 podcast series titled Extrasensory, an Apple original podcast hosted by actor Will Sharp. This series took a fresh journalistic look at the Pollock case, interviewing family members and reviewing Stevenson's work with a modern eye. The producers managed to do something quite remarkable. They got Jennifer Pollock, after decades of silence, to speak on record about her experiences. They also interviewed John's granddaughters from one of his sons, who gave their perspective on John and Florence. The podcast revealed new twists, primarily the conflicting views of John as described earlier. To Jennifer, John was a doting, loving father. To his adult granddaughters, he had been a difficult patriarch. This adds a layer of complexity. It suggests that the truth of what happened may lie tangled in family dynamics. It's a reminder that behind every paranormal case are real people with virtues and flaws. The podcast investigation also raised doubts about specific pieces of evidence. For example, it clarified the common confusion about the famous photograph being falsely linked to the Pollocks, which, while not evidence per se, shows how easily narratives can get distorted. More seriously, it questioned Stevenson's methods at time, noting that one of his associates, Dr. Banerjee, who briefly got involved with the Pollock's case in the 1960s, had been accused of fraud in other instances. Stevenson himself was impeccable in integrity by most accounts, but if an assistant were unreliable, did that affect anything with the Pollock's case? The Extrasensory series doesn't flat out debunk the case, but it does what we've attempted here, presents multiple angles and leaves the listeners to decide what to believe. They even confronted Jennifer with the idea that perhaps her father exaggerated or even lied about some of the childhood incidents. Jennifer's response was not what the interviewers expected. She defended John's character, suggesting that at least from her vantage point, he was genuine with them. This implies that if any embellishment happened, Jennifer might not be aware of it. She doesn't recall the past life talk from childhood, so she can only rely on trust in her parents' accounts, and she trusts her father wouldn't lie about it. This is a poignant outcome. After all these years, one of the twins essentially still isn't sure what to make of it, except to have faith in her father's narrative of their early years. In the broader context, scientific interest in cases of children's past life memories continues modestly, mainly at the University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, where Dr. Jim Tucker has carried on Stevenson's work into the 2000s. They have collected new American cases, like the well-known case of Jace Leininger, a boy who believed he was a World War II pilot reborn. The Pollock case is part of their archives and is often brought up in academic discussions about same family cases. It remains somewhat unique. Most of UVA's cases involve different families. Same family cases, like the Pollocks, are emotionally powerful because they involve immediate loss and recovery. If such cases are even possible, they offer immense comfort for bereaved parents. And indeed, there are parents who, inspired by Pollock's, have looked for signs that a new child might be their departed one reborn. From a cultural standpoint, the Pollock twins' story taps into a rich vein of folklore and spiritual yearning. The idea that twins can be mysterious, and the deeper idea that life might have a cyclic continuity. The Pollock story offers both intrigue and a kind of resolution. We've journeyed through the tragedy, the hope, the evidence, the doubt, and we circle back to what we make of it. Perhaps the truth of the Pollock twins lies somewhere in the space between questions and faith. It is a story that does not force a conclusion, but rather invites you to ponder possibilities about the resilience of love, the mysteries of the mind, and whether the threads of life might weave in ways we do not fully understand. In the end, whether or not Jillian and Jennifer were Joanna and Jacqueline, the Pollock family found meaning and comfort, and the twins grew up loved and loving, which is its own kind of happy ending. The case remains open in the sense that no one can quantitatively prove or disprove the reincarnation claim. Thus, it serves as a gentle provocation. What do you believe? As you drift to sleep, you might find yourself imagining those two little girls in Hexham, combing their father's hair, playing on the swings, living ordinary lives touched by an extraordinary mystery. And that in itself is a thought both soothing and stimulating to carry into dreams.